I want to really thank the organizers, and particularly Mary Lou. I was involved with Maddie Lou at the very beginning when she had that notice in the Wall Street Journal, and I responded to it, and I asked her what is she going to do with her foundation and raising the money, and I hoped that she would encourage research, because research is needed, and she responded back, and I've been in touch with Maddie Lou and then Mary Lou ever since. And I'm so pleased that the foundation has come a long way, and I know Mary Lou's leadership was vital for this development, and I just want to congratulate everybody who's worked so hard for this foundation. I can't stay for the final panel discussions. I really want to get my remarks in now and show how much I appreciate what everybody's been doing. So I've been asked to talk about epidemiology and the genetics of Blepharospasm. Most of my talk is on epidemiology because there's a lot more information about that than there is about genetics. Only 15% of my talk at the very end is going to be on genetics. 3 slides, in other words. Epidemiology deals with many things, including how common the disease is, how often does it occur, what kind of populations have it, how does it get worse, what are the age of onsets, what's the gender effect, how often does it spread, and so forth. What are risk factors? What are the things that protect against getting the disease? And that's what this first part of the talk is all about. And okay, so this is sort of like a summary slide. There have been a large number of studies. Most of the studies have been about other focal dystonias as well as blepharospasm, so they weren't limited just to blepharospasm for most of the studies. Many countries of the world have got data on this. I put the name of Giovanni Di Fazio up here because when you go through the literature, you find he has produced a lot of the research studies. And so I just want to make sure this audience knows how much this man has done. He's a neurologist from southern Italy. He's been heavily involved in the research on blepharospasm, and I just want to give my appreciation to all his work. It was from one of his reviews that he analyzed the prevalence rate. Now, prevalence rate is how many people in a certain population have the disease per population. So, and this number is like the range was from 1.6 per 100,000 population to 13.3 per 100,000. He'll often use per million, so it would be 10 times 16 to 133. Now, the largest number, the 13.3, is from his own study, southern Italy. That's really an outlier. Most of the studies have probably averaged around 3 to 4 per 100,000, and I'll show you some of that data. So different populations have different rates, prevalence rates. And again, because of his study in Italy, Italy seems to have had the highest rate. The age at onset, as Dr. Camella said, is usually in their 50s and 60s, and women are more affected than men. This is that DeFazio review article that was now 14 years old, and this is where he got the number. As you can see, the bottom here on the bottom, 133 per million. And that's in southern Italy. He accepted only 5 studies that were really highly qualified to be included in this review. The first took place by Jay Nutt at Mayo Clinic in Olmsted County, Minnesota. Mayo Clinic is particularly noted for doing epidemiology work because in the entire county of Olmsted County, they see the majority of those people who live in that county. And the few other hospitals in that county have allowed the Mayo Clinic researchers to access their medical information. So they have medical information of all the people who live in that county. And that's why it's such a rich source of data. And the prevalence rate that he found was 1.7 per 100,000. This is per million here. The next study that came out was 7 years later in Japan. That was the lowest number, 1.6 per 100,000. Northern England, 3.9. And then 8 centers in Europe, 8 countries in Europe, 3.6 per million. So the Europeans are around 3.5 to 4 per 100,000. And the dysphagia was, as I said, was the largest. Just to show you the prevalence rate of blepharospasm, taking the highest number, the dysphagia number, and comparing to others, primary torsion dystonias was 33. So if this was really closer to 3, all of primary dystonias is about together 10 times so higher. So about 1/10 of all primary dystonias are blepharospasm, an average. Here's the hemifacial spasm that Dr. Camella talked about, and then there are others. So ataxia is in the same ballpark as multiple system atrophy. Tourette's, of course, is much higher. Parkinson's disease is higher, and essential tremor is higher, and restless legs is massive. So blepharospasm is right in there, but it's not, as I will point out, the most common of the focal dystonias. From our own studies, when we had a dystonia research center, we looked at the people with different kinds of focal dystonias. Here we see in this color code larynx, they have spasmodic dysphonia, where they have tight vocal cords, where their dystonia involves that. Cervical dystonia with the neck muscles, also called torticollis. And here's the upper face. This is blepharospasm. And children tend to go on to become generalized dystonia. Now, each color code is 100%. So here's the blepharospasm. This is the age and onset of our blepharospasm population. You can see here's the 40s, 50s, and 60s into the 70s. But the laryngeal and neck dystonias are down here into the 30s and 40s, reaching up a little bit in the 50s. And the generalized dystonias, these are people who get dystonia in childhood, usually in their leg or arm, and they can go on and become generalized. And you can see almost all of them are below the age of 10, reaching into maybe the 20s, and it's just a straggler's little older onset. There are many other types of epidemiological data that have been obtained, many from botulinum toxin clinics. Those data are not quite as valuable as doing population studies because it's a sort of a biased population. These are people who come in for the studies, and they can compare how many cervical dystonias come in, how many arm dystonias come in, how many vocal cord dystonias, how many blepharospasms. So it's not quite the best kind of epidemiology studies, and most of these big reviews try to overlook those kinds of studies. The whole population studies are the best. That is where they have all the medical data from a certain population, or their door-to-door inspection of families, and even randomized with the way dysphagia did, going door-to-door, like every fifth house or something of that nature to see how many people have vocal dystonias, including blepharospasm. So that's the kind of studies I'm going to be talking about. The Mayo Clinic had a follow-up study from the J. Nutt study. This is run by the ophthalmology department, and they found in Olmsted County 8 people at the time they did the study, which gave them a prevalence rate of a little less than what J. Nutt had found, and also an equal population for men and for women. Age and onset ranged from 42 to 82, with a mean of about 61. It took about 2 years before the diagnosis was made after the symptoms first involved, and the lower face was involved in about 4. Those people, the other 4 had limited to the upper face. 2 people, interestingly enough, out of the 8 had remissions. One occurred after 8 months after onset, another one after 15 months after onset. Remissions, as Dr. Camella pointed out in her slide, is quite uncommon, and usually if they do occur at all, it would occur in the first year of life. First year of blepharospasm. Okay. Another study, what I thought would be interesting to point out, is Iceland. Iceland has a very limited population, about 330,000 people, but it's also a pure ethnic group. Almost all the people come from some Scandinavian country, settled there, and that population has been inbred and survived, of course, all these years and decades. So I thought it would be interesting to look at their study, and this was looking at all the primary dystonias, as you can see from the title. So they found 90 people with focal dystonias, giving a prevalence rate of about 31 per 100,000. Cervical dystonias was the next highest. Of those, cervical dystonia was the highest. The little larynx, and then here's blepharospasm, about 3. The same thing has been found, again, in many of these countries, and including others in the United States and so forth, in Europe, about 3 in Europe. So this is about the same level. Then oromandibular, which is jaw and mouth, And then there were some segmentals, multifocals, and so forth. So this was an interesting study, I thought, in showing the comparisons in an isolated population where they had good medical data. And again, they have medical data on everybody in that country. And by the way, Iceland is a very important country for studying genetics. Because of all the family histories and everything known, they can trace back people and they can find out gene mutations and so forth. There's a lot of research that's being done in genetics in Iceland. This is from that study. And now what we looked at was primary focal dystonias, but you can see that there's also segmental dystonias where they had blepharospasm with oromandibular, blepharospasm oromandibular and cervical, and so forth. Here's upper limb and cervical, and whatever. And multifocals, you can see spread to other parts, more distal parts of the body, and even a generalized that had blepharospasm in it. So if you take all those other dystonias that are not just limited to the eyelids, the numbers come up to 24, and now the prevalence rate of all the blepharospasm is 8 per 100,000. Here's a study, another study in Italy from Sardinia. What was interesting about this study is that they looked at different ages of the population, and the number of cases below the age of 30 were 0. And then they found a couple below 44, and they get increased with age. And therefore, the prevalence rates, this is per million now, so you can see it goes up to like 29.2 in women per 100,000, and much less in men. Again, you heard that from Dr. Camilla. So much less in men. But you can see age is a big factor. So the older you are, in other words, the more likely you're going to get blepharospasm. Now, just to round out the more recent studies that I found, there were 2 studies that came out in 2006 in Japan, Western Japan or Northern Japan, and higher rates than almost every other country. India also, Calcutta, India, had a similar rate. And there was one study overall that I found that had the incident rate. Now, incident rate is how many new cases per year per population size development. And this was done at the Kaiser Permanente Health System in Northern California. And so they took all of their population who come to the Kaiser Healthcare Center for care, and then they looked at how many new cases per year came up with blepharospasm, and it comes out about 1 new case per 100,000 per year. So if you translate that, let's say, to a city like New York, maybe 6 million people in New York, that would be about 60 new cases of blepharospasm per year in New York. Now, age and onset and spread. Again, this is the Fazio study. And again, looking at spread, here, this is called a Kaplan-Meier survival analysis type of curve on the abscissa ordinate. You see 100% means it's focal, and the lower percentage means it's no longer focal, it is spread. And you can see that blepharospasm spreads faster than cervical dystonia, about twice as fast. What they did that was unusual was they took the age of onset into consideration. If you look at age and onset, they spread at the same rate. So they're concluding is that maybe why blepharospasm people tend to have spread of their blepharospasm is because it's an older population, and somehow age is playing a factor in the spread of focal dystonias to become segmental dystonias. Out of Serbia, Vladimir Kostek was one of my former fellows. He's chairman of neurology there in Belgrade. He looked also at hand dystonia spread. Again, Kaplan-Meier curves, hand dystonia spreads less likely than torticollis, which is cervical dystonia, than compared to blepharospasm, which spreads the fastest. Now, what are some of the other risk factors that I can find in the literature? Well, age we already talked about. Female gender was talked about. Dr. Camello talked about dry eyes, blepharitis, conjunctivitis, and we're going to have a whole talk about that in this conference. I'm going to talk about genes next. This new paper just came out a couple of months ago about sunlight, and I want to show you that. I found that very interesting. Another thing that I've read, and a lot of this was from DeFazio's work, about coffee drinking. Apparently, the more coffee you drink, the less likely you're going to get blepharospasm. And he did this in his Italy. Italy, they drink espressos. And the more espressos these people drank, the fewer people he found with blepharospasm. This is the sunlight thing. This paper just came out in April. And what they did, they organized this about the average amount of sunlight that these countries have per year. And it increases. The more south you go in the northern hemisphere, the more sunlight. And then he listed them here. These were their epidemiology studies. Here's Iceland. Here's Norway. Here's the Netherlands, northern England, London, Little France, northern France, southern Germany, Munich. Now we're into Serbia, Rochester, Minnesota, Rome, now southern Italy, where DeFazio is, Segovia, Spain, and northern Japan, southern Japan, and Kolkata, India. And you can see, what they did is they looked at the prevalence rates or the number of cases who had blepharospasm, the number of cases compared to the cervical dystonia. The cervical dystonia is more common in general than blepharospasm, so it took the ratio, and the ratio in the least sunlight was 0.2. That is only ratio blepharospasm to dystonia. But if you go down to more sunlight, in general, the trend is they have higher and higher blepharospasm compared to cervical dystonias, and the highest was Calcutta, India, 0.6. I thought that was very interesting. It probably needs confirmation, but it is something to think about as a risk factor is the amount of sunlight. I like to show this slide because Dr. Hallett is part of this paper. It was a review with Dr. DeFazio and Biridelli from Italy, comparing other focal dystonias. Here's the blepharospasm, and this is per million now, and this is that ratio that DeFazio had. And again, I said that's a little bit of an outlier. It's probably more closer to 4 to 6 here, 40 to 60 in this table because this is per million. And you see dysphonia is in the same category. Torticollis is greater, and then hand dystonia is probably a little bit less even. Gender, most of the focal dystonias, not just blepharospasm or women over men, except for hand dystonia. Hand dystonia is what we call writer's cramp. When they start to write, their hand tightens up, their arm tightens up as a dystonia. The mean age at onset is greatest for blepharospasm than the others. I showed you that earlier dysphonias, torticollis in our own populations was at around 40. Hand is maybe a little bit less. Again, spreading more in the blepharospasm patients than these other patients. And this little sensory tricks that Dr. Camello talked about, touching the corner of the eye, for example, can open up the eyes. Sometimes coughing will open the eyes. Some people I find with blepharospasm, talking opens the eyes. When they stop talking, the eyelids close. And I learned from one of my patients, she says she's a terrible dinner partner with people at a dinner party kind of thing, because when she sits with people, she talks all the time, and nobody else can get a word in. And that's the only way they can keep her eyes open. So fortunately, when we gave her a botulinum toxin injection and got rid of her blepharospasm, she was well invited to all the dinner parties. Anyway, again, possible risk, focal irritations in the area of the dystonia, sore throats for the laryngeal, trauma of the neck and for torticollis, and repetitive task of the arm for the hand dystonia. Okay, the last 3 slides about genetics. In general, this is again from DeFazio, about 11 to 30% of all people with blepharospasm have a relative with a focal dystonia, not necessarily blepharospasm, but one of the other focal dystonias as well. And I have cervical dystonia here. There's no proven gene yet that has linked all of these or linked the blepharospasm itself, even with the family members. There are very few family members reported. They do fit as what's called an autosomal dominant pattern. That means you can inherit the gene from a single parent. You don't have to have 2 parents carrying the abnormal gene, transferring it to the individual, but a single parent can do it. And of course, not all autosomal dominant families are 100% penetrant. In fact, most people who have genetic diseases, they're skipped generations at times. They're called incomplete penetrance. And that may be the pattern also for blepharospasm. It turns out in these kinds of studies, they looked at what blepharospasm was like in those who have family members and those who don't have family members. It turns out they're similar. Same amount of coffee drinking, statistics, same kind of age and onset statistics, gender statistics, and so forth. So it doesn't matter if you know you have a familial case or a non-familial case, they're going to have the similar blepharospasm. There's one gene that seems to be linked in some way in at least one paper. This is the TORA1A gene is the gene for childhood onset dystonia, called DYT1 dystonia, that was described over 100 years ago initially, and the gene has been found, and it can cause generalized dystonia. But there's a polymorphism that was found in this that seems to be higher linked to people who have blepharospasm who had a spread of their blepharospasm. So it might have made the blepharospasm a little more severe because it spread. This has not yet been replicated, and it needs to be done. So we don't know about that. Now, here's a family study, again from the DeFazio group. They looked at 56 families with blepharospasm, and they found 15 people in that 56 who had other affected members. And it turned out they had 18 affected members. Some were blepharospasm, and some were other focal dystonia. There's oromandibular, there's cervical dystonia, hand dystonia. Of these 15, 13 had focal dystonia only of the eyelids, and 2 had it spread to other parts, let's say the jaw or the neck, as Dr. Camella pointed out. But these were the family members. And then they continued this study to another one a few years later. They expanded the number now to 122 people. They went to different centers. I forgot how many centers in Italy that collected their patients together. They found 122 people with blepharospasm who participated in the study. Turned out 23 had a relative with blepharospasm. There were 18 of those people. And so if you add them together, it came out 41. So there are 41 blepharospasm people who have a positive family history. There are 99 with a negative family history. And they showed that the sex ratio, that is women to men, are again higher, women to men. Schooling was about the same. The age at onset was the same. Here's 56.8 versus 57.1. Blepharospasm part of segmental was about the same. Prior eye disease was about the same. And ever drinking coffee was about the same. So it didn't matter if it had positive family history or negative family history. Things came out to be about the same. So there's still a lot of work to be done about genetics, clearly, and we need a lot more information in the future. And thank you very much. Of course, I'll answer questions at the panel discussion. Thank you.